It still stings to think that the Quakes failed to make it to the playoffs this year. There was so much promise and excitement with the arrival of Bruce Arena and the work that he had done in the offseason. Especially after the 2 early season wins, it really felt like the potential of the 2025 San Jose Earthquakes was magnitudes higher than any other year we've seen in the PayPal Park era. Unfortunately, the season didn't quite play out the way Quakes fans had hoped for. But now, having come to the end of the season and this first chapter into Bruce Arena, we can take a moment to reflect on this season and his management of this team. My name is Kevin, I'm joined by Luis, and together with the Quakesaholics. In this video, we'll be giving our first year review of Bruce Arena, discussing roster reconstruction, tactical identity, player development, accountability, and overall Bruce Arena's impact on the club. If you like the video, let us know, and if you want to get more, be sure to get subscribed. We've got a lot planned for this offseason. So yeah, I guess in doing this research, Luis, I felt like my opinion of Bruce Arena was swayed. I'm curious, before we get into this, if your opinion had changed at all, and if so, how?
Surprisingly, yeah, I do think I give him a lot more grace. Looking a bit into just, general statistics about the team, looking more into the kind of performances certain players have had, and also sort of the expectations that he would have of the team going into it. And yeah, I was kind of swayed. So, yes.
Yeah, I think definitely when I started my research on this, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to nail Bruce because we didn't make playoffs and I'm mad and this and that. But although comparing to last year is an extremely low bar, I do think that Bruce has done a lot of things correctly this year, which kind of get the Quakes on the correct path. But if people disagree, you can let us know, and let's see how we got to this conclusion. So we start off first with inherited squad and early influence. In this case, we're mainly talking about what Bruce did in the offseason, the players that he chose to retain, which ones departed, and of course, most importantly, which ones he brought in. And so if we look at the actual moves that we made, we actually let go of 14 different players and held on to only 21. If you compare what we ended with in 2024 versus what we had at the start of like the transfer window in 2025, that's a reduction of 40% of the players. That is a lot of fat being cut. And honestly, the players that were cut were exactly that. They were the fat. They were the players that were constantly being criticized by Quakes fans. And I think, honestly, we didn't retain anyone that I was thinking, okay, this person can't be here anymore. And we didn't really let anyone go that I thought, oh, this person should have definitely stayed with the team. I think everything made sense. And so for that, I do give Bruce a lot of credit. And then when you look at the players in, I mean, obviously the ones that scream out as like the big ticket signing was Chicho and Joseph. And now having reflected on this entire year, these were players that definitely lived up to the expectations. These were our highest goal scorers. It's been a long time since we've had 2 strikers that each have double-digit goals and assists to go along with that. And I mean, even beyond that, you look at people like Harks as another player that definitely proved his worth and was a key contributor for this team. And then
Dave Romney as well.
Yeah, exactly. Like Dave Romney. And I do think that there are some people that don't, universally love a player like Romney, Kay, Roberts, Floriani. But even those names are players that, at least for good stretches of the season, did prove their worth. And so really the only players I can kind of pick at are Lima and Edwards. But I went back to this, and Lima was a free agent, and Earl Edwards Jr. was a backup goalkeeper that we got for $150,000, and I think in GAM. So like, in terms of like, I mean, $150,000 for you and me, that's a lot of money. But in terms of roster construction, that really isn't a lot. And even going beyond that, like the deals that we got for some of these players, Joseph Martinez, again, that was a free agent. Chicho Arango was $700,000 in GAM for this year and $700,000 for the next year. So like, these are excellent players at excellent prices. And like I said, there's only maybe 1 or 2 players that you can kind of critique, but they didn't have that many minutes. And so overall, the players that I brought in were good, and they were key contributors. And we talked about this when we first signed Bruce Arena, that he has done heavy reconstructions of rosters for the Galaxy, for the New England Revolution. And in both those cases, it took him until the 3rd year as manager to actually win any trophy. And so this reconstruction, in my opinion, was a lot more aggressive. And I think it maybe incorrectly set the expectation in my mind that we would kind of compress that 3-year timeline. I didn't think that we would win necessarily this year, but I definitely did think that we'd make the playoffs. But anyways, in terms of the offseason, I think it was a very exciting time to be a Quakes fan, and the Quakes are making noise all around the league.
Yeah, I think that in terms of the offensive output, like you said, Chicho Martinez, it was a fantastic year. Of course, great assists, also great numbers all around. We ended up being 4th in the West for goals, 7th overall in the entire league. So great numbers, great returns from those players. The one thing that I will say, kind of looking back, is maybe you could have had a bit more maybe depth in center back position. However, looking at this roster, again, we as Quakes fans kind of know what was being dealt with. When we saw the offseason moves, we were all pretty much in agreement. We didn't get to see too much of Bruno Wilson. Rodriguez was a diamond in the rough, sort of, last season, I would say, maybe. I think that if Bruce Arena were to see the roster and, see that there's a lot of money already being allocated towards center backs, I could see why he doesn't think that was a priority area. But I do think in hindsight that would have been nice. But, overall, yeah, I have to give Bruce Arena a lot of credit for the business that he was able to do. Of course, DeJuan Jones as well, coming in the middle of the season, one of the best players on the team immediately. Also fantastic business.
The critique of Bruce in terms of roster construction might be that we held on to Pellegrino. I think there are examples like that where the player is under contract and there's nothing we can do about it. Like, we're not just going to buy out his contract. That just doesn't make sense. So for that reason, we retain him. But I think that is a good transition into what happened in the season, the in-season moves. And I think this is where Bruce still held up, and I think he still had a positive impact. Definitely, like you just said, DeJuan Jones was a fantastic piece of business, only $425,000 in GAM plus international slot. Later on this season, we saw Ronaldo Vieira come in. Ronaldo Vieira hasn't had that many games, so I don't want to speak too much to that, but from what we've seen, it is very promising. But I think while those are excellent signings, I mean, so far they've proven to be excellent signings, I do think that there are a lot of blemishes, and I think it starts with, for example, Hernan Lopez and Pellegrino. I think these are players that at the moment that these loans were announced, I think a lot of fans understood why. And I mean, even we were like, yes, this makes sense. You look at someone like Pellegrino, this is a player that was making like $900,000 a year, maybe $1 million a year. And all he did this year was 2 goals and 1 assist. And it's even worse when you think about that one of the goals and the assists was against DC United, who was the worst team in the league, and we blew them out 6-1. And the other goal was against Sacramento Republic in the Open Cup, which is a USL team. So that just kind of goes to show that like Pellegrino's output in terms of like the average MLS opponent that we played against was pretty abysmal. But I think it becomes a blemish when you look at Pellegrino last year being the top goal scorer. And yes, it is a low bar. It was only 7 goals, the worst Quakes team in the history of the league, blah, blah, blah. But he also did get the Golden Boot in Norway the year prior. And now with San Diego FC, in only a few matches, he's far surpassed his output in San Jose and has become one of their biggest contributors at this later stage of the season. So, and yes, San Diego's a much better team, but the fact is that Pellegrino had good output before Bruce and now has good output after Bruce. And I think that is kind of what I'm getting at, that like it kind of is a blemish. Yes, his position as a left winger doesn't really make sense. I think when we finally switched from that 3-5-2 to the 3-4-3, there just wasn't space for him. Like, there was no way that you could take Chicho or Joseph off the field, and Chicho played that kind of hybrid left wing 10 position. But I think it is a shame that Pellegrino wasn't able to be, I guess, a bigger contributor. I definitely was expecting more. And then for Hernan, I think this one is a lot easier to analyze. I mean, even from the first game, we talked about that visible frustration that Bruce had. He turned around, held up the 2 fingers up to his technical staff after Hernan gifted possession twice in quick succession. There was that red card in Kansas City. So I think Hernan just had a really rough start under Bruce Arena and just continued making too many individual mistakes. And I mean, again, when we saw that tactical switch from a 3-5-2 to a 3-4-3 and Harks and Beau just kind of claiming that central midfield duo, there just really wasn't a place for Hernan. And what I'm trying to get here is that in the moment, the Hernan loan made sense to us because there wasn't a position for him on the field. But I think we were all under the expectation that because he was a designated player getting loaned out, that would open up the money and the salary to get a new designated player a couple months later in the summer, and that never happened. And so I think the blemish there is that you have a player that the Quakes have heavily invested in. This is our record signing for the club, and by like twice the runner-up, if not more. And to not have a replacement for him and just kind of go into the second half of the season with only 2 designated players, while we had this kind of premise of win now when it came to every other position of the roster construction, I think it's a little bit questionable. And I think that if Bruce knew that Hernan wasn't going to be playing, it's not Bruce's responsibility to think, okay, let's loan out Hernan so we can kind of save $1 million in salary for the Earthquakes. Like, Bruce can't be thinking about money that way. Bruce has to be thinking about what tools do I have and what can I do with them. And if you have someone who is promising and has talent the way Hernan has, I don't know why you wouldn't just hold on to him as a depth piece if there was no commitment from the Quakes and Quakes ownership to get a replacement. So I don't know. For that reason, I think looking back at it, those two moves a little bit questionable, but I think he definitely set himself with DeJuan Jones for sure.
Yeah, well, I do think that Bruce Arena, when we saw that appointment, there was that sort of expectation that we would see results now. But like you said, when Bruce Arena has had success in other teams, it did take some time, right? If I'm not mistaken, about 3 years usually is when a title would come around. And although we did see some off-season business pointing to the fact that we would be pushing for a playoff position this season, Bruce Arena is here to stay. That's not, up for debate. And with that being said, I think that the system that Bruce Arena had implemented for this team just didn't really have a place for someone like Hernan. I think Hernan did have his chances as well. He was not performing well. Like you said, he was a frustrating player to Bruce Arena, but also to fans as well. I think the expectations that we had of him were a lot higher. I think he probably was actually better last season, if you could believe it. He came back from injury, really didn't make too much of an impact. Hernan is probably best suited to, and I think this is something we've talked about before, a team that is built around him. And I just don't think that was going to happen with Bruce Arena, given with Chicho and Joseph coming in. That wasn't really going to happen. And I do think that given that Hernan wasn't really fitting in this team, it made sense for him to go on loan to somewhere like Argentinos Juniors, who is at a league that he has had success in before, to retain some of that value. So that's where I would push back a little bit, is if Bruce Arena is here to stay for a few years, he has to take in consideration the resale value of someone like Hernan, who is a record signing transfer. We might take a loss. If we were to sell him today, we would definitely be taking a loss. But I think at the time, it made sense, looking at it in the longer term, 2-3 years, just to keep that value up, expecting and hoping that he performs well in a league that he has performed well in before.
That makes sense, but I think then that just becomes a case of trying to find the best players for a system rather than the best system for the players that he does have. And the reason I think that's problematic is because Hernan was like a $7 million signing plus a $1 million salary. Pellegrino was also like closer than $1 million. So at that point, you're looking at like, $9-ish million, and then to kind of misuse that, I think, is what creates points of friction with ownership. And we saw this, for example, with Matias Almeida, where he would get a lot of quote unquote his guys, they wouldn't perform, and then ownership stopped trusting him with more money. And I wouldn't want that to be the case. And I wonder if maybe that's why we didn't see any big signing in the summer. And I know there's like a lot of rumors about maybe the Quakes ownership changing, and maybe that's why they don't make splashing cash right before a sale. But I don't know. I just think that like if there was no commitment to get a replacement, I don't think it made sense to offload Hernan.
Right, but like you said, the Almeida thing, which I agree with, of course, was when his guys weren't performing, but Bruce's guys are performing. Do you force Hernan in there where Espinoza, Joseph Martinez, and Chicho Rango can create and make goals as they were, especially near the beginning of the season when we still had Hernan? And again, when Hernan came in, I think that was a player that was very much underperforming. And I see what you're getting at. There was a compromise made probably of what are you getting from Hernan. But I do think overall at the time, the team was getting points. They were scoring goals. That output was there.
Again, like I said, like signings like DeJuan Jones, and specifically in the context of like what changed during the season, Ronaldo Vieira. I mean, even things like Oscar Verhoeven going on loan to San Diego FC, Marie getting loaned out to Tampa Bay Rowdies, all those things kind of make up for this fact of the Pellegrino and Hernan situation. And I especially think that if these things were all talked about between Bruce and John Fisher and whoever else needs to be in that conversation, like if everyone's on the same page of, we're not going to get a replacement, we want to retain Hernan's value, as you're saying, then that's fine. And I think that's totally okay to do. But I think because we don't have that transparency of why are we making these moves, and or maybe why aren't we making other moves, that's kind of where I have some doubts. But again, the positives I think outweigh the negatives in this case. Now we got to this point where the roster was constructed. We move on to tactics and lineup consistency. And this kind of the spirit of this is, how did the team evolve tactically? How did Bruce kind of adapt to different kinds of opponents? And what was his influence on the team? And I think this is the part where I don't really think that there's an identity to the team tactically other than being a protagonist and nearly every game that they play, but then having no correlation between dominance and results. I think a better correlation is, quote, did the Quakes make individual mistakes, and then yes or no, but depending on that, you can determine the likely outcome. And what I'm specifically talking about here is, Kansas City at home, Rodriguez having an abysmal performance, St. Louis away, Edwards giving up a disastrous penalty at the dying moments of the game, RSL away, Daniel has like an easy shot that goes straight out his body and then it goes deflected into the goal. I mean, the examples just go like on and on. And it was like a whole season thing, and I think there was definitely repeat offenders as well. But then when I think about like times that the Quakes played poorly and like were actually outplayed and dominated and outright deserved to lose, I think there are very few examples of that. Maybe on one hand you can count them: Columbus away, St. Louis at home, recently,
Charlotte,
Charlotte, LAFC. Those are definitely matches in which the Quakes were not protagonists, and like, yeah, we deserved to lose. So for that reason, it's kind of hard to say like, was it more on Bruce? Was it more on the players? But I do think that because we saw a theme in the high defensive line, and then that exposing players to making individual mistakes, and Bruce trying to rotate different players, we played every single center back at one point in the season as a starter. I don't think there was anyone that was never a starter.
If you want a statistic, only Romney and Munie had more than 20 starts out of all the center backs.
Wow. And that's out of over 30. Wait, that's MLS only?
I think it's total, the whole season.
Total. So that's 34 in MLS plus
37.
30, plus 3 of Open Cup. So yeah, that just kind of shows that like there was a lot of rotation, but yet there were still the same mistakes. And so while I want to put some blame on the players, I do think it is questionable to be seeing these same repeated mistakes, seeing that, you're changing the variables. The issue is the high line. Either the team isn't bought in, they aren't executing the way he wants to execute, and he's like continuing to try to force it. And I think one of the things we talked about was I really wanted to see more games where the Quakes didn't try to be the protagonist. I wanted to see more games where, maybe we play with 5 in the back. And we didn't see this until San Diego away, and that was a game that we won 1-0 against a very difficult opponent. So to summarize, I do think tactically there was a lot of evolutions. We went from very different formations, but the identity was to always try to be the protagonist, be on the attack, and I just don't think that always worked out very well.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to agree with you in terms of results. But with that being said, I mean, I guess the kind of question is, if you want to sit back, and I'm not saying that sitting back is bad, but if you do want to sit back, are you okay with not having the same kind of output that we've seen this season? I think that the way that Bruce Arena plays, like you say, this team defensively has been built front to back, not back to front. It's about the players pressing high, especially the front three, whether that be Espinoza on the right, Martinez, maybe Judd as well, who's a fast player who can give you that intensity, Chicho Rango, who's willing to get physical with his counterpart. You have them. And I also think that explains the midfield profiles that we have on this team. The signing of Ronaldo Vieira, usually it's the front three pressing, and then those two midfielders also having to do a lot of running around. You think of Ian Harkes, the lungs on that guy, right?
Yep.
It's like he's got 2 hearts and 2 sets of lungs at times. You have Mark Anthony Kaye as well, Ronaldo Vieira, who we highlighted as having honestly pretty shocking on the ball statistics for midfielder, but who is very physical. And even LaRue as well. He's a player who's more creative, more technical, but I think at one point was leading the league in interceptions early on. I remember hearing in the broadcast, and the guy on the broadcast couldn't believe it either. So there is a lot of pressing, and as you press high, that means that of course you can win the ball back. Kind of a cliche, but yeah, you win the ball back, of course, and then the point is that when you do win the ball, you're closer to the opposition goal. It's a lot more intense, so players on the other team don't have as much time to kind of do what they want to do. It's a very disruptive way of playing. To kind of point to this, the Earthquakes were 3rd in the entire league in terms of possession won in the opposition's 3rd. So the numbers are there to say that we are good at pressing. I do think it is very chaotic. There's also a lot of long balls as well. The trade-off you have of having midfielders who predominantly are there to press is you don't really have that creation, I guess, from the midfield. There are times where, we saw Chicho or Espinoza even kind of dropping in behind maybe a Judd or a Martinez. But overall, you don't have as much creativity in the midfield. And that means that you have a lot more long balls and a lot more crosses as well. Of course, having the full backs up so high also gives you a lot of width too. We were first in the league for accurate crosses per match. We were 8th in accurate long balls per match. That just kind of goes to show that this is a team that was just shooting long balls. And I think that also kind of goes toward why maybe Bruno Wilson got more minutes even after making a lot of mistakes. Why Daniel Munie, although a few times maybe had some mistakes earlier in the season, would still be played because they were able to distribute the ball well, and we could bypass the midfield, so we didn't need that much creativity from there. But yeah, like you said, to not discredit what you're saying as well, there was a lot of times where we would get exploited in behind. Going back to AYSO, if you kind of remember, one of the first things they teach you defending is press, cover, balance, right? I think there's a lot of press. There was decent cover, but there was no balance. I have screenshots from the Charlotte game where Mark Anthony Kaye is the last man back. I have pictures where Bruno Wilson is losing possession of the ball 10 yards into the opposition of the other team when they're not even sat that far back. So it is kind of all over the place at times. And I think, there is ways of mitigating that risk. Maybe you have a good offside trap, but the Earthquakes don't do that. There's a lot of screenshots where Ricketts is playing someone on side, where Rodriguez is playing someone on side, where there's a runner in behind. A lot of the times for the other team, they do a long ball, not for the guy who's going to receive the long ball to score, but for him to win it, and then a second ball, and another runner to be the one to score. And Rodriguez doesn't see that. And I think that's another reason why I give a lot of grace to Bruce Arena is, again, it is his first season. And I think one major thing that I kind of was thinking about, how much Rodriguez and Bruno underperformed, just from the perspective of these are very well paid center backs. Overpaid center backs defensively. Do they offer something in offense? Maybe. Maybe not as much as they were before, but I'll give them that. Yeah, they're good on the ball. They have some technique to them, but they were underperforming defensively. And, on the other hand, you had players like Daniel Munie, who this really was like his breakout, solid MLS player season, and Reed Roberts and Floriani, who I think I have some trust in for sure, but came out of the draft. You have Jamar Ricketts, who gives you a lot offensively, but is very inexperienced and naive at times, I would say, defensively. Or Victor Costa, where in the system where you do have to play direct and you do have to be comfortable flying high as a center, as a fullback, doesn't offer enough offensively. And I think that's something that is just kind of the nature of these players. Of course, there is some give or take in terms of how much they can be improved. And I think some of those improvements take time. And, Daniel Munie, I think, is a good example of that. But I feel like I will agree there's a lot of individual mistakes, but I also think that's a reason why maybe Bruce Arena needs to tinker with it a bit more. It's kind of one of those things where it's like chicken or the egg. Are they making mistakes because they're not getting regular playing time, or are they not getting regular playing time because they're making mistakes? I will give some grace for that. And I think that's probably one of those things where maybe a second season you kind of need to really get down to. I think Duan Jones as well, him being injured near the tail end of this season, I guess, was such a big drop off in quality.
So if you had to give him a letter grade, what would you give him in terms of how he managed the Quakes tactically this year?
So in terms of what our approach was starting out the game, not including substitutions and stuff.
Yeah, not subs.
Yeah, I would say a B, I think, at least. B at least, maybe even B plus, because the coach, at the end of the day, he doesn't play the game. Right?
Yeah.
He puts the players that he thinks can execute well. This is a team that had a historically poor defensive record. And given that fact, tactically, I think he did okay.
That's fair. I'd give him a B minus. I see what you're saying. I just think that the constant rotation of center backs and then seeing the same disastrous errors every week, I think that is
something that he highlighted, though. It's not like he doesn't know. He's not naive of that.
Right. And like you're saying, I do think more so than just a second season under Bruce, I think a second transfer window could do him or sorry, a second out of season transfer window, not a
Yeah.
summer transfer window. I think it'll do him a lot of good for sure. But yeah, I guess the next thing to talk about is the in-game management and substitutions. And I think this one is probably gonna be a shorter segment. I think we probably have very similar opinions on this one. I think that anytime players like Judd or Buddha came on, it was a great substitution. We saw this work out in many games. I mean, for me, the most important game is always the Galaxy game, and when we played on the road, Judd assisted to Buddha for the lone goal win. I think that's a great example.
Great moment.
Yeah, great moment. We were
Great
there.
moment.
Definitely one of the
I can't
happiest
sing
days.
what we were singing, but it was a great time we had.
It was definitely a great time. I mean, there's definitely more examples. I mean, Vancouver at home, like if you think about this like Clash remake jersey, I can't think of a player that comes to mind more often than Judd. Like when I think about that jersey, it's
Yeah.
like Judd in that seismic union stand
Yeah.
with the kid, yelling, beer being poured on him.
Grit FC.
Yeah, Grit FC
Yeah.
for real. And then, I mean, another great substitution that we would see, I think we saw this more in the beginning of the season, was Beau for K or vice versa. I think that those were pretty interchangeable players, just depending on the, scoreline, basically. But then outside of that, I think, honestly, like, Bruce had some pretty questionable habits. I mean, anytime we saw Lima or No Buck, I felt like it was just kind of throwing in the towel for the game. I also think timing, I think sometimes substitutions felt like they were too late in the game. Like if you throw on Judd with only 10 minutes, like realistically, he's not going to be saving us every week. He needs more time than that. And then also other times too, like we just see too many changes at once. And I think the example that I think we've mentioned like 4 times at this point is against San Diego, just completely subbing out the midfield, doing a complete switch up, and then that game just escapes our hands. We had 3 points and then we ended up with 0. Anything else on substitutions?
Like you said, there were a few times where Judd or Buddha would come on and it'd be great. But yeah, I think the San Diego one is just a really easy example to point to. I think there's a lot of times where Noah Buck would come on and it was questionable. Again, not trying to just single him out, but if you have, if you're chasing a goal, if you need some creativity, maybe if teams are holding onto a lead, I don't really see his skill sets applying to that situation very well. One thing that surprised me was that Quakes were 11th in the league for possession, and I think a lot of that comes to maybe game state. I think it's possible that a big reason why playing so aggressively creates so much chaos and can work in your favor is because the other team is also chasing the win. But if the other team doesn't need to chase anymore and they just have to defend, do we have the tools to really break down a defense, or can we get the ball to Espinoza enough, and do we have the men in the area to score across? Those kind of things are questionable. There are players that are good on the ball, like LaRue, who got a lot of minutes at the beginning, but not so much kind of near like the third quarter of the season. And then Nico as well, who regressed quite a bit in terms of minutes this season. Those kinds of things are where I have some questions about, can this Quakes team, turn a loss into a tie or into a victory. I will say in terms of holding off results, it was better. But yeah, still definitely some concerns, some questions there, I think.
At least on the bright side, he did end off on the season with some really good substitutions that we were questioning very heavily in the moment. Jack Scan and Nico coming in against Austin and then turning that result into a win.
Get some credit there. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's about how you finish, not how you start. It's definitely not as good of like a letter grade, if we're going back to that analogy, as like the tactical and like lineup kind of conversation that we just had. But I also don't think it was like totally disastrous either. Like we would see under Lucci Gonzalez certain substitutions of certain players, and it was just like guaranteed we are going to fold and we're going to lose that game. And I think in that sense, game management wise, we got Grit FC back. Like we got some of that.
The win against San Diego, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like putting on all those defenders, but it worked,
Right. Right.
There were also good moments as well.
Yeah, like a C. It's
C minus kind of.
It's still like, a passing grade.
Yeah, exactly.
And on to the next category for evaluation is player development and relationships. Bruce does deserve a lot of credit in terms of giving the youth a handful of opportunities. And I think obviously the most standout ones are Munie and Judd. I mean, those were players that last year we weren't even sure if we wanted Judd for this year. Like if we're being completely honest, like when we saw his contract get re-signed in 2024, we're like, oh, interesting. I mean, a shout out to them as well. They just got their contracts renewed. They definitely deserve more than what they're getting paid. So happy for them. But like these were definitely like in the most improved for the Quakes. Beau, LaRue, Jamar Ricketts, Those are players that, they were Town FC players or got a couple minutes here and there with the first team. And this year, like, they both, more so Beau, of course, but I think Ricketts as well. Like, they had their stretches in the season where you would see them in the lineup and you would say, yes, they deserve to be in the lineup. I do think that Bruce needs credit there. I mean, Beau is a name that we didn't even really know. And we saw that name on the RSL lineup for the first game. We're like, who is this? And he killed it, and he ran away with it ever since then. And even with like the draft players, I don't know how much Bruce was involved in making those selections. I feel like traditionally it's been more like Chris Leach kind of role to make those draft picks, but like Floriani and Roberts, they got a lot of minutes this season. And even when Reed Roberts had his individual mistakes,
I'd almost give Bruce Arena more credit if it was a Leach decision to bring them in.
Yeah, no, honestly, yeah. But yeah, what I was saying is like, we saw Reed Roberts have a couple bad games, and he wasn't just like straight outcast for the rest of the season. He got his next opportunity and he took it well. And I think that's good on Bruce that he was able to get these players that honestly a lot of Quakes fans didn't really believe in and turned them into, household names for us. So definitely did very, very well there. Anything else on the highlights?
Yeah, no, definitely agree with a lot of those. In terms of the over performances, just in terms of the money that was being allocated toward those players, gotta give a lot of credit as well. Jamar Ricketts, probably another name that we saw a lot more from than we would have expected, just based off. We didn't get to see too much of him last season, but my understanding is he wasn't really a fullback by trade when he joined this team. So to get that kind of return from a player like that, to get those kinds of starts. Floriani, of course, where. Do you know right now if Floriani or Rodriguez should be like who starts over the other? Kind of depends, yeah, right. And I think for that to be, you can see that both ways, of course.
Yeah.
But regardless, I think we did see a lot of solid performances. Leroux, of course. I mean, how many times have the talent that he has is incredible. He's a player. I've said this before, but I'd be really surprised if he doesn't get a call up to the national team at some point. He's only 22 years old as well. So, yeah.
He's a player that got a man of the match award in a game where Messi was also involved.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, fantastic talent. The goal against Galaxy, right?
Yeah.
At home, like.
At Stanford, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of player development, I think it definitely is an A plus. But I do think that the player fallouts are a smudge again on Bruce Arena. And I think the most obvious one, if you've been following in this later part of the season, is Rodriguez and Daniel. Like, they weren't even on the bench on team sheet for decision day. They weren't injured. At least they weren't on the injury report. And just judging from their social media activity, it seems like they are kind of like over the Quakes. Like it feels like something happened. We have no information on this, but it feels like there was some kind of a rift there. We don't know if it's performance-based. Rodriguez had his, maybe not handful, but he had a couple pretty bad games. Kansas City at home definitely sticks out. So to see those relationships just kind of like deteriorate to the point where like they're not even traveling with the team at times, I do think that is not a good look. And Hernan departure, we already talked about that. I also do think that there was a little bit of like if you made an individual mistake, you'd be kind of outcast for a game or two. We saw this with Rodriguez. We saw this with Reed Roberts. Reed Roberts did eventually come back, which was good, but yeah, it just feels like Rodriguez just never came back. And it could be injury related. It could be other, personal life things. It's complicated when you don't have full transparency. But it did kind of feel like a pattern where if you made a really bad mistake, you'd be kind of outcast. Really, the last kind of, I don't know if it's like a player fallout. I think there was like a little bit of friction. Definitely felt like with Nico. Bruce had that interview early in the season. I think it was with Landon Donovan and Tim Howard on their podcast. And he was talking about like a rough paraphrase of a quote of like 18-year-olds that think they should be playing in Europe. It felt like that was really a targeted conversation at Nico and like how Nico wasn't happy with the minutes that he was getting. And he did have injuries. There was also very tough competition with there only being two central midfielders. But again, coming back to that more like substitution conversation that we just had, if you find a way to bring in Noel Buck in a game where you're trailing, I don't know why you can't find time for Nico to be playing. And I mean, it worked out against Austin, so it was good there. But I definitely think that Nico should have been getting more minutes. And just, again, based on that early season interview, it feels like there was a little bit of a rift.
Right, and I mean, I opened the discussion earlier on or not talking about sort of the player value. I think that if it wasn't for this U20 World Cup that just came around, where Nico was definitely a standout player for the United States in terms of the value you'd probably put on Nico last season to what he was at before that World Cup is probably like 500,000 or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like that was also a concern. Yeah, like you said, just a few players where their value, I guess, probably took a toll. Their performances took a toll. Bruno Wilson, is he just not good enough for this league? Or is he just like injury prone? And, you know, definitely there are some sort of concerns there about performances and return from players who, as much as maybe we don't associate them with the best of times, are familiar faces.
That does seem like a long list of players that there were like some kind of fallouts with. But I do think that in terms of the players that develop positively, I do think it outweighs. And I do think that
Yeah.
the contributions that players like Munie, Judd, Beau had were far greater than like the setback of like seeing Hernan leave or like not having Rodriguez around for a couple games. Although it is annoying to see these kind of like fallouts happen and these kinds of like points of friction, I do still think that Bruce did well in how he managed teams, and it seems at least that the player relationships overall, they seem pretty positive.
Right, and I think I don't know if we talked about this earlier, but the name Bruce Arena and kind of the history and the weight that has. Of course, would we have gone that DeJuan Jones signing?
No.
Yeah, right, and yeah, that's kind of the Bruce Arena, and that's something that we highlighted as well that I think is a strength of his, despite what other people, maybe fans like ourselves, may think. He's gonna just kind of see the roster and pick the guys that he wants, which is why you get a LaRue, starting and the success that comes in that, and also why you see a Noah Buck come on and the questions that come, after a decision like that as well.
The last thing, I think this is something that definitely wasn't top of mind for me until I saw Matias Almeida come in and like how much he really did impact the club culture. I do think one of the last categories here is like, how has Bruce impacted the club culture in terms of, fan perception, how the players feel, or I guess how the players seem to feel. Roster reconstruction was a huge morale boost in terms of just like confidence that fans have in this club. I think in terms of match prioritization, a lot of credit needs to be given to Bruce, particularly with how he handled the US Open Cup, which I'm going to get into the Open Cup in just a second, but we haven't seen, for at least I can't remember, in like multiple years now, of the Quakes going into an MLS match and rotating and playing more of the depth players because they're thinking about a different game that's coming up, or like they just fully committed to an Open Cup game and so they're going to rotate. And particularly we saw this against New England and St. Louis, which I guess you can argue in hindsight like those points would have really been valuable towards making playoffs, but the reality is that rest is needed somewhere, and that may, like, it was like what was it, 11 matches, 9 matches? I remember it was like
we had a really busy May.
Yes, it was like, it felt like every week we had 2-3 games.
Yeah.
And that isn't the norm for MLS at all. And so those kinds of decisions are very difficult to make, but they have to be made. And I think that Bruce actually committing to the Open Cup is something that we really need to commend him for, because no other coach has done that. And I think the Open Cup deserves a lot of merit in terms of like the run that we made. Making to the quarterfinals is something that we definitely did not expect at the beginning of the season. And we talked about the Open Cup versus the Leagues Cup, and the reality is that, yes, the Open Cup, the level of competition is not what it used to be. Teams don't take it as seriously because the Leagues Cup is just so much more lucrative financially. Like,
yeah.
We've talked about it. If you want to know more, watch the video. And so to make it really short, basically more or less is that like if you play well in MLS and you place high, you make the playoffs, you're gonna go play in the Leagues Cup, and if you don't, you're gonna go play in the Open Cup. And so for that reason, when you evaluate like what the Quakes actually did, they knocked out Sacramento, they knocked out Portland, and then they lost to Austin. And so really it's like, okay, you beat one MLS team. And so on that surface level, it seems like this wasn't that big of an achievement. But I just want to remind people that playing against a USL team, the MLS team should always win, but the Quakes don't always do that. And we've seen too many times the Quakes go out against the USL team. So to actually say, you know what, we're going to fully commit to this game, we're going to play some of our best players, I think that deserves commendation. And then on top of that too, beating Portland isn't anything to belittle. Portland is a team that has made the playoffs this year. And
yeah.
I guess it's like play-in game, but they won that.
Yeah, exactly.
They won that, so like they are truly in the playoffs now. And we did lose against Austin, which was a team that did make it to the playoffs this year, and we lost to them on the thinnest of margins.
Yeah.
And honestly, we just straight up got robbed by the refs. Like they were
Yeah,
giving
no VAR, of course.
no VAR. Actually, no. I think from quarterfinals onwards there is VAR.
Really?
I think so. But anyways, besides that, like VAR or no VAR, Espinoza takes a cleat to the thigh. They give him a huge gash, and I think there was no card, nothing.
No.
They were Austin was giving 2 penalties in game, and then they beat us on penalty kicks. So like you can't there is no thinner margins than going out the way that we did against Austin. And I think it definitely hurt in the moment because how we advanced, we would have been hosting games. At least we would have hosted the final if we had made it. But I think the Open Cup run definitely kind of like reinvigorated that idea of belief and hope that like this team can actually find success. And that's not something that I've felt as a Quakes fan in a long time, in a very long time. And for that, I do think that Bruce Arena deserves a lot of credit.
It's nice to feel like we took that competition seriously because of, yeah, like you said, you win a couple games, and next thing you know, you're just like 2 or 3 games away from a final. And as a fan, like that's a lot to look forward to. Yeah, and like you said, the loss against Austin was just like, what can you do about?
Yeah. In terms of player buy-in, that one I think is kind of hard to tell from like the outside, but the one thing there is like I do think that grit FC and like that mentality of like playing until the end, even when you're down, like giving it your all, I do think that we've seen that a lot more this year, and we haven't seen those matches where the Quakes just like completely fold in the last 5 minutes of the game. Yeah. We saw that so many times last year. And yes, there's still individual mistakes, but they're a lot more controlled than last year, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I will say, just personally, my perception is that the players where you could have questions about where their mind's at are not really Bruce's guys. I think they're players that were here last season or the season before that.
And who knows, they might be gone. Like
yeah, exactly. Like, just being transparent. Like Rodriguez, I'd say, is a player that I've had some kind of questions about just because of his lackadaisical defending at times, some individual mistakes, and because I have high expectations for him.
And it hurts to say because he was one of my favorite players going into the season.
Oh yeah, absolutely, so, yeah.
Yeah, hopefully that situation gets fixed, but yeah, I do feel like it's like one foot out the door kind of thing. Yeah, honestly, I don't really have anything in terms of like what Bruce didn't do well for club culture. I think one thing, if there is feedback to be given, is like just more transparency in terms of player availability. We would see at times like, Rodriguez and Daniel, that's an example that we've already given, but also like DeJuan Jones. I don't feel like they ever really put out a timeline for like when he would come back. And I don't even know what the injury was or when it happened, if it was in a game, in training. Maybe he covered it in one of the press conferences that we missed. But yeah, I don't know. I just feel like there needs to be more transparency around there. And also, what is the intention with transfer windows? And I know that like no coach would ever do this, but like letting Hernan go, but then not getting a replacement for that. I feel like either Bruce or Chris Leach or just someone, I feel like as Quakes fans, we deserve to know more. But I understand that that's wishful thinking.
Yeah, it's not like that degenerated in some way this season, right? Like it's
not his fault.
Yeah, it's always kind of been like that. Like we had that with like Danielle too last season. I feel like, if I remember correctly, and Bruno Wilson too. I feel like every time that guy's injured, I never know what had happened.
Yeah,
never. He just disappears, and it's like, okay, guess we'll see you in a few months or something. Yeah. But yeah, I do have to give some shout outs to Bruce Arena for just the feeling around the club, going as a fan, the win at San Diego, the win at against Vancouver. Those do a
big
lot.
Moments.
Big moments. They do a lot for, earlier we talked about maybe baggage being a concern. I don't think, even if we didn't make playoffs, I think it's one of those where it's like, I don't really think players are going to have that as like a major weight, kind of weighing them down. I feel like it's unfortunate, but overall you come out of the season feeling like, okay, like for those legacy players or players that have been here before Bruce Arena, this is progress.
Yeah, and I was just actually thinking about this. It isn't just the Quakes players that were here last year. Like you think about all the New England Revolution players that came in. Revolution was a really bad team last year. They still kind of are this year, but like those players had their own set of baggage at that club. And even Joseph Martinez playing with Montreal. Montreal was a very unsuccessful club. Of the players that came in, like, yeah, DeJuan Jones definitely came from a winning team, from Columbus Crew.
But he wasn't getting minutes.
Yeah, he wasn't getting minutes. So, like, yeah, who knows what that did. And, like, Chicho, although RSL was, I don't remember if they made playoffs, but they definitely were a better
I mean,
team
he
last year, but
was
he,
like out of the.
yeah, he had personal off-field issues that yeah.
Yeah.
We've already talked about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, like all those, yeah, you're right. Like all those players did have baggage in one way or another, and I do think that although they didn't make the playoffs, this was it was a big jump for them. And as fans, it's like annoying because between 10th and 15th place, there isn't really any difference in terms of like not having a
Yeah.
postseason. But
I don't feel anger or anything
yeah,
like that.
yeah, I think I got my hopes up just because of how strongly we started this season. But if I reflect on like where these players were at, where the fans were at, where the club was at, almost every sense the Quakes have made progress.
Yeah.
And I don't really have any reason to believe that more progress can't be made. I think there are small things with like figuring out who should be the starting center backs and giving them more regularity. I think that like that's one thing. Maybe not pushing as high when we're in possession. But those are like
Maybe a new
small
owner.
things. Yeah, maybe a new owner, knocking on wood. But I think those are all things that we can fix. I don't think there's any problem that can't be fixed under like with Bruce as the coach. I feel like that kind of just summarizes the future outlook, but to kind of answer the question, should he stay? I think we both agree that yes, he should stay. And I think the biggest thing for me in terms of concerns is, like we mentioned, or at least like I mentioned, I feel like there is a slight bit of like underutilizing talented players because they don't fit his system. And my concern there is we're at this position, we're playing a 3-4-3 formation, and three up top are Joseph Martinez as a striker, Christian Espinoza as the right wing, and then Chicho as the fill in the blank left wing as the number 10. It's a kind of a hybrid role that at times feels a little bit awkward, and it feels like, especially with DeJuan Jones when he is available, it feels like this team is very right side heavy. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that Bruce is looking at. And I would really hope that there isn't some, what's the word? I hope they're not considering a trade-off of like switching to perhaps like a two-man front line, like a double striker system, and then that leaves Espinoza in this like awkward position where he is, in my opinion, our best player, but there isn't a clear position for him. Or going and committing to like playing with a true natural left wing, but then you have to make this decision of like, okay, do we go with Joseph or Chicho as the 9, and is one going to play on the bench or is one going to lead the team? I don't think there's an easy solution for this, but I really don't want it to be that one of those three players has to leave, because those are our three best players, and I would hope that we can find a way to have them all in there together. And I think the only other thing is like last year's roster construction was heavily based on, you know, older veteran players with like a win now mentality, and age is something that catches up with all of us, unfortunately, and like the clock is ticking, and a lot of these key contributors are, you know, in that age that for most soccer players it is towards the later end of their careers. And so I hope we're not trying to make these incremental changes, and then by the time we're almost just there, everyone is just like a little bit past their prime.
Yeah.
I think those are my only like two main concerns, but I think it's well compensated for in terms of Bruce Arena is a big name. It's undeniable that the big names that are coming to this roster are because he is here. They trust him and they trust where the Quakes are going. And while I do have concerns about this like very aggressive style of play, I must admit it is very, very entertaining to watch. It doesn't feel like we go to a game ever expecting there to be less than like 3 goals total.
Yeah.
Like a 4 or 5 plus goal game is not that surprising when it comes to this version of the Quakes. And even though we didn't make the playoffs, his historical trend has never been to grab a team and instantly win. And when you compare how he has performed to other Quakes coaches who have been given a lot more time, his numbers are basically up to par in terms of win percentage, and in terms of points per game. It's basically the same as, you know, some of the best seasons we've had for the Quakes in the past, I don't know, 8 to 10 years. So if we gave coaches like Matias Almeida, who also didn't make the playoffs in his first year, if I'm not mistaken, if we're giving him like 3-4 years, I don't see why we wouldn't give Bruce more time.
Yeah, definitely agree. And, you know, as I was talking about also in terms of some of those, you know, concerns about rotation, do I want Floriani starting, do I want Rodriguez starting, Mark Anthony Cade, just all those kind of questions, I think he's going to have some answers now. Overall, I feel like the soccer will be more refined. At least I think it should be more refined. And of course, a lot of these questions will be answered by the kind of business that we see in the off season.
So yeah, I think that wraps it up for us. If we made it this long, I know this was a lot longer than our usual one. Hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think. If you agree, disagree, we'll be reading the comments. I think our next video will probably be the player tier list. I think I want to do that one next. So if you're interested in that one we will get more into like the individual players, not just Bruce. Definitely get subscribed. Yeah, I think that's it from us. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.
Thank you guys.